Good afternoon and welcome to the Berean Coffee House. My name is Kevin Short. Here we talk about faith, life, culture, all from within a Christian worldview. Why Berean? Because the Bereans' nobility was found in the fact that they both believed but also were willing to investigate. Why Coffee House? Because the English coffee house played a rather important role in the development of the Enlightenment, and quite frankly, I enjoy coffee. So, it's been a busy couple of weeks since my last video. I apologize that it's taken me a while, not that I have all that many of you. But last time I began what I plan to make a 3-part series. I made the point last time that our ethical disagreements come down not to disagreements on issues, but ultimately they come down to this idea that there is no such thing as modern ethics. We instead have a number of differing ethical positions people have with differing sets of foundational claims, and where we differ are not ultimately on the issues but on the foundational claims. There are 2 or 3 points that I think are important to understand here, and so I plan on reviewing my own position on them. The reason why I say I'm reviewing my own position is because there's more than one position out there on these points. And, there's many areas of philosophy that simply aren't settled. And all one can do is state, this is where I stand. And quite frankly, in a format such as this, getting into too many of the technicalities, which I probably do too much of already, isn't very helpful. So, let's start with what is a worldview. That is a term that gets thrown around quite a bit, especially in our circles, particularly by people involved in apologetics. But we often have different understandings of what it means or how it functions. If we were speaking in a very, very technical sense, the definition that I would give these days is that a worldview is our master paradigm, that it is the paradigm that unifies, guides, and forces the development of all of our other paradigms. And if you are not a philosopher, I realize that makes absolutely no sense. Fair enough. A worldview is a statement of our understanding of how the world and how the universe actually functions. It includes our views of what are known as metaphysical views, what is the really, really real. It also includes certain elements of how do I know what is really, really real. And it impacts our ethics. What do I do in response to the really, really real? Still, probably not very helpful for many of you, but it's at least a starting point. So I'm going to give you what I consider to be a couple of helpful illustrations. I like thought experiments. Anybody who's a philosopher likes thought experiments, and some of the more crazy sci-fi oriented ones are probably some of the reasons why some people get involved in philosophy in the first place. Maybe. But let's start with a thought experiment that will help us understand what a worldview is and how we form them, or at least how I believe we form them. Some people believe we form them in different methods. That comes down to ultimately what is our worldview itself, ironically, but I will give you my point of view. I want you to imagine for a moment that an architect developed a plan for a building, had said building built, and then died. Tragically, after his death, they realized that his blueprints were not on file anyplace, and that they had been lost in a fire. Boy, this architect's building is having some trouble. So, what the owners of the building decided to do was to get a number of different architectural students to come into the building, maybe knock on the walls a little bit, and try and recreate the blueprints from what they saw. Now, said blueprints from the different architectural students would need to include information such as the supporting structures that were inside the building that were not immediately visible and could not necessarily be easily accessed without tearing the building apart. It would need to include information about the foundation of the building, and it would need to include information about where all the electrical lines were running through and things like that. Why? Because a building's blueprint is a practical thing. It is sometimes consulted by maintenance or when things need to be overhauled or redone or something like that. And the different architectural students came up with very distinctly different sets of blueprints, presenting different views of what was really real about the building. Now, that is how we have developed our worldview, and that is ultimately why there are more than one worldviews, and why there is a debate between them. The building, in this case, is the universe itself. And we have naturalists who have presented a view of how they believe the universe runs. There are deists who present a somewhat different view. Theists who present a somewhat different view from naturalists and sometimes from deists. That's a topic we will have to take up at another time. Pantheists, polytheists, and some who don't even believe the building or the universe itself exists. They believe it is all a dream or something else. None of these positions is automatically something that can be proven. They are all things we have inferred. And we have put together in our minds a structure of how it works. That's the way I think we form worldviews. Now, again, I say that can be a little bit controversial because the idea and the term of worldview begins in German idealism. And in idealism, it really led to an extremely subjective view of everything. And it led to actually a point of view that would differ very much from the things that inform my discussion of how we form a worldview, because I'm working from what philosophers would call a broad foundationalist approach to justification and knowledge. And many of the German idealists were in fact working from something similar to what is known as a coherentist view of truth, or a coherentist view of justification, which means something is justified on the basis of the fact that it fits into your worldview. And I believe that worldviews instead must have some kind of input for their development from things that we know from the external world, or things we come to believe, I should say, from the external world. So, a little bit complex perhaps, but if I can put it this way, when we start debating between theists and naturalists, as I noted in a recent short video in which I stated there is no such thing as a God of the gaps argument, I stated that naturalism was not some kind of neutral starting point for our debates, as many naturalists for some reason seem to think that it is. Now, my sense impressions of nature, my sense impressions of the world around me, yes, those are properly basic, and I can know that I have those impressions. But what they mean, including this idea that something called natural law exists, well, that's something that has to be proven from the data. Now, it's not a bad extrapolation from the data. It's not the simplest extrapolation. By the way, for the naturalists out there who think that their view should be the assumption, because it is the simplest, well, in point of fact, the simplest possible thing that I can take from the data is that nothing exists other than myself, and that everything I see around me is just a dream and I'm hallucinating. I don't believe that point of view. I don't believe it holds. But if you're really trying to make an argument for the simplest explanation, that would be the simplest explanation, not naturalism. So once again, that is not a sufficient basis for saying this ought to be the primary set of assumptions. Now, one of the reasons why I don't take the German idealist view is because much of it starts with Kant. And Kant begins with the idea that metaphysical truths can only be known or should only be believed if they can be known with certainty. It's something that starts with Descartes as a response to extreme skepticism. Now, I don't believe that certainty is the goal, and I don't believe certainty is even achievable for most things. There are some things that we can know for certain. 2 plus 2 equals 4 is something we can know for certain. 3 minus 4 is negative 1 is something we can know for certain. And I can know for certain that I exist. But many of the things we believe, and that we believe we have certainty about, we cannot know for certain. Why? Because we cannot prove that we are not a brain in a bottle, or being confused by an evil demon, as Descartes put it, or many of these other types of little philosophical thought experiments. We can't prove they're false. Now, my answer to those who raise those possible claims is I don't have a good reason to believe they are true. But that doesn't give me certainty, that just gives me probability that they are false. That is, it is highly improbable that I am a brain in the bottle. Actually, my own version of the brain in the bottle experiment is, I think my name is Kevin Short, I think I am married, I think I have a son, but in reality my name is Tony Evans. I killed my family, and I am actually in a psychiatric facility on a Thorazine drip, and all of this is a hallucination to dull my dangerous conscience. And the only piece of evidence I can think of to support said view is the fact that only a madman would come up with it. Take that as you will. So a worldview is our understanding of how we think the world works. And we tend to use it, and we tend to compare what we learn to it in order to learn more. So, if that's what a worldview is, let's ask a second related question. What is a religion? This one's a lot more complicated. In large part, it's more complicated because there's not a lot of agreement, and we tend to try and treat worldviews differently. And if I can phrase it this way, we tend to treat worldviews differently based on our worldview rather than based on a starting point of where are we going to have these discussions. So, what is religion? My definition, and again, this is mine, there are a lot of others, is that a religion is, number one, our belief and answer to the major existential questions and metaphysical questions that we all have. Number two, our proper response ethically to that belief about reality. And number three, the communities that we form around those beliefs and around those practices. So we have, for religion, we have beliefs, practices, community. Three things define a religious movement. Now, I wouldn't say that every religious belief leads to all three, but those are the three major components. Sometimes a statement on community can be a community of one. Why do I take that stance? I take that stance because it does fit within a lot of the discussion within several philosophers of religion on the question. It summarizes it in a way that I think is fairly understandable. And I think it includes elements outside of just worldview that are important for a discussion of religion. For example, if we talk about religion just in terms of belief, what do we do with religious rituals, what do we do with religious practices, which are very much a part of the ethical situation the ethical dimension I discussed. And then what do we do with religious organizations? Especially the different types of religious organizations. You say, what do you mean, different types of religious organizations? Well, as a Baptist, I am a member of an individual local Baptist church. That Baptist church is a part of the Southern Baptist Convention, so a group of churches, but the two organizations, while related, are a little bit different. I go to Christian bookstores and Christian websites, which are not, in fact, denominational bodies, but sell books that are related to religion and have oftentimes a religious purpose. And I have broader discussions with Christians who might be outside of my tradition. I am a part of something called the Evangelical Philosophical Society. And this is, once again, an organization. It is a community, but it's not a community in the same sense that my denominational body is, or that my local church is. So you start to see why I say there's more than one type of religious organizations, and how we map all of these things out is important. Now, one of the things I stated early on was that there's some tendencies, if we're not careful, to apply our worldview in defining the word religion. And this is very important when we just start discussing naturalism. And the very real question of, is naturalism a religion? There are actually two oddities, at least, that in philosophy of religion are sometimes referred to as quasi-religions or something along the lines. One of them is naturalism, and the other is communism. And this isn't just a small, minor point of debate. There is actually a very important philosopher of religion named Alvin Plantinga, perhaps the most important for, or in the past 100 years. So I am going to read Plantinga's statement on this matter. He writes, "Now it is not clear that naturalism as it stands is a religion. There is enough vagueness around the edges of the concept of religion for it to be unclear whether naturalism does or doesn't belong there. But naturalism does serve one of the main functions of a religion. It offers a master narrative. It answers deep and important human questions. Immanuel Kant identified three great human questions. Is there such a person as God? Do we human beings have significant freedom? And can we human beings expect life after death? Naturalism gives the answers to these questions. There is no God, there is no immortality, and the case for genuine freedom is at best dicey. Naturalism tells us what reality is ultimately like, where we fit into the universe, and how we are related to other creatures, and how it happens that we came to be. Naturalism is therefore in competition with the great theistic religions, even if it is not a religion itself. It plays one of the main roles of religion. Suppose we call it a quasi-religion." And he's not the only one to make similar notes. It is often noted that the new atheists, the so-called woke, and progressives behave about their philosophies as if it were, in fact, a religion. My position, quite frankly, is I'm not sure what kind of cash value we get from the addition of the word quasi. I'm not sure how it's helpful. And so I think it's probably best just to consider naturalism and just to consider a few other systems of thought to be religions in and of themselves. By the way, and this may be controversial, I would also include Scientology in kind of the same category. So while I do think Scientology began as, quite frankly, a cash-generating scam, does it meet the criteria of a religious set of beliefs? Yes. Now, I am not making a statement about many of the questions around Scientology, so don't quote me as saying that I think Scientology should get IRS tax credit. The Church of Scientology in many ways is somewhat more like a religious bookstore than a denomination in the way it seems to function, but that's not an area where I am an expert anyway. I would just note, while it's controversial, that that would be a similar situation as what I take with naturalism. So, back to the question of naturalism. Is naturalism a religion? I'm actually going to say yes and no. As a set of religious beliefs, as a worldview, naturalism itself is incomplete. What is, I believe, a religion are political systems of thought that have originated from naturalism. Communism is one of them, and it has long been noted to be a religious system. But communism is also influenced by German idealism, as was the Nazi movement to a certain extent. Another system that is sometimes called a political religion. And in the American context, I would probably include both progressivism and libertarianism. At least libertarianism that I knew growing up. I hear people now talking about left-wing libertarianism, and they seem to have a different idea than the old extremists on the free market. But I do believe that also is, in a sense, another political religion. And if I can give you an illustration of the journey that I think humanity has taken here. In the medieval period, there were essentially believed to be 4 categories of religion. Not 4 religions, but 4 categories. 3 of them were religions in and of themselves: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And then there was pagan. Now, pagan at that time was not what we think of. When we think of paganism, we tend to think of people who are practicing what they believe the ancient polytheists in Europe or in the ancient Near East practiced. I say what they imagine because in many cases we don't actually know what they were doing. We just have some guesses. But when we start entering into the period where Europeans began exploring the world outside of the Levant and outside of Europe, they began to run into systems of faith that really didn't fit into any of those categories. Sorry, I should mention that pagan was instead the miscellaneous category. It would include somebody who believed in Thor and Odin or Zeus and Artemis, but it would also include an atheist who happened to be a Greek philosopher. That is, it was anything that was neither Christian, Islamic, nor Judaistic. But as we began to explore the world, they began to find systems of thought that were different enough from the things they thought they knew and the way they were previously categorizing religion, and they began to realize that the system had to change. And so they began to add things like Buddhism, Hinduism, and other systems to the catalog of religions. So naturalism, in a sense, was an attempt to get rid of religion, but in so doing, as is often the case in these types of tendencies to oppose what we might call partisan religious beliefs to find a unifying principle, was to create another one. Naturalism, in my view, then, is not so much a religion, but a family of religious or of political religions. So, that being the case, it is my belief that many of our ultimate differences in matters of marriage, in matters of abortion, in matters of capital punishment, are actually religious conflicts. Not necessarily armed conflicts, but nevertheless religious debates. And in some sense, the current problems we have are things like wokeness. Now I'm very cautious about that term. I don't like it. Tends to prove too much. But it does seem to refer to at least some groups that have neo-Marxist tendencies. I say neo-Marxist. I know some people dislike that term, but I say neo-Marxist because I don't know how else to refer to somebody who's trying to rescue Marx from Lenin, Stalin, Mao, and the other moral monsters of the early 20th century. So neo-Marxist it is, unless somebody can give me a better term, and if somebody can give me a better term, I'll use it. But many of these points of view are not merely religious, but almost cultish. That is, they don't operate from a well-developed, rational, and reasonable approach to religious questions. They do not see a need, for example, among other things, to justify their foundational ethical beliefs. They merely assert them, and if you question them, they simply assert them more loudly. Not a viable strategy. But I believe that at least identifies, in a nutshell, the basic fact that the conflict we are in is religious. And how do we answer this? Well, that's a question of apologetics. It's not a question that I am ready to answer today, or let me rephrase that, it is an answer I'm ready to answer today, but it would take us too far afield from our approach and our discussion of the ethical debates that we find, something that I think we need to consider since the Charlie Kirk assassination. So, next time, I intend to get into what I might call the practical ramifications. And that's going to lead in a couple of different directions, but that will close out this series. My name again is Kevin Short. I'm a Christian philosopher of religion. You can contact me through here or other places. I am available for speaking engagements, and I hope you have a good day. Thank you. Bye.